Well, we had a premiere. Was it last night, 2 nights ago? At 75, Richard Gere finally stopped running. The man who defined Hollywood. Charm for decades just shared 10 words that made the world pause. It wasn't about his blockbusters or red carpets. Instead, he revealed a truth that took 3 marriages and half a century to understand. He admitted he wasn't always a man someone could stay with until now. Who is the woman who changed everything, and why did it take a lifetime to find her? Join us as we uncover the real story behind Richard Gere's search for wholeness. Pennsylvania roots. Long before he was a movie star, Richard Gere was a quiet, thoughtful kid. Growing up in Syracuse, New York, and later Pennsylvania, he didn't fit the typical mold of a future Hollywood heartthrob. Instead of chasing the spotlight, he found his comfort in music and deep thinking. He played the trumpet and even wrote music for his school plays. For young Richard, the trumpet wasn't just an instrument, it was a way to create a private world where he could express feelings he couldn't put into words. This musical background gave him a sense of peace that set him apart from other kids his age who were focused on more traditional goals. Could put on a mask by playing different. Could put on a mask by playing different characters. He could be anyone, a hero, a rebel, or a lover. This was a perfect solution for a young man who felt very insecure about who he actually was. If he were performing, no one could see the real Richard, who felt uncertain and out of place. This ability to perform became a shield, but it also meant that even when he became famous, he was still just playing a part to keep the world at a distance. His time at the University of Massachusetts, where he studied philosophy, added another layer to this quiet life. He wasn't just interested in the how of life, but the why. He spent his formative years reading about different ways of seeing the world. These big ideas about existence and the mind stayed with him long after he left school. While most young actors were focused on getting their next big role, Richard was already thinking about how to find a deeper meaning in life. These early studies in philosophy planted the seeds for his future. They taught him that the fame and noise of Hollywood weren't the most important things, which is why he eventually felt so comfortable stepping away from the height of his career to find silence. But as his fame grew, so did the list of women who tried to get behind that mask. Rising stars, restlessness. As Richard Gere's career began to take off in the 1970s, his personal life moved just as fast as his rising fame. During this time, he was a young man driven by a deep ambition to succeed in Hollywood because he was so focused on his work and his mysterious public image. His romantic relationships often felt like short chapters in a book rather than long-term stories. One of these early partners was Carol Mallory, a model who described him as someone who was constantly moving and changing. Another was Penelope Milford, his co-star from the movie Days of Heaven. While these women were important to him at the time, Richard struggled to stay in one place. He was more interested in his own growth and his career than in building a permanent home with someone else. He didn't quite know how to be the kind of partner who stays, mostly because he was still trying to figure out who he was. Everything changed in 1978 when he took a trip to Nepal in India with a woman named Sylvia Martins. Sylvia was a painter who introduced Richard to a completely different way of living. This trip was a massive turning point. While traveling through the Himalayan mountains, Richard met Tibetan monks and began to learn about Buddhism. He sat in ancient temples and listened to teachers explain that the material world, things like money, fame, and looks, wasn't what actually mattered. This encounter created a permanent split in his life. On one side, he was a famous actor whom everyone wanted to look at. On the other side, he was a spiritual student who wanted to sit in silence and find inner peace. These two worlds didn't fit together easily. As the 1980s went on, Richard became one of the biggest stars in the world. He was even named the sexiest man alive, a title that most people would dream of having. However, for Richard, this fame felt like a hollow performance. He started to feel very uncomfortable with the way the public saw him. People looked at him and saw a golden boy or a heartthrob, but inside he was feeling a growing restlessness. He found that the more famous he became, the more he wanted to withdraw. He began to spend more time meditating and working on humanitarian causes, trying to help the people of Tibet. He realized that being a movie star was just another mask he was wearing, and it was a mask that was starting to feel heavy. He was looking for something real, but he was still moving too fast to find it. Then at a sunny summer party, he met a woman who would make the whole world stop and stare, the mismatched icon. In 1988, at a sunny outdoor party in Beverly Hills, two of the most famous people in the world met for the first time. The party was hosted by Herb Ritz, a famous photographer who was friends with both of them. Richard Gere was 39 years old at the time and was already one of the biggest movie stars in Hollywood. Cindy Crawford was only 22 and was quickly becoming the most famous supermodel on the planet. Even though there was a 17-year age gap between them, they felt an immediate and very strong connection. It wasn't a planned meeting for the cameras. It was a natural spark between two people who were both living at the very top of their industries. For a while they were the most photographed couple in the world, appearing everywhere from magazine covers to the biggest red carpet events. As the years went by, the pressure of being Hollywood's perfect couple started to weigh on them. They were constantly surrounded by photographers and fans, and their schedules were incredibly busy. In 1991, they decided to get married very suddenly. Instead of a massive wedding with hundreds of guests, they flew to Las Vegas for a tiny private ceremony. They didn't even have real gold wedding bands. Instead, they used rings made out of silver foil from a gum wrapper. While some people thought this was romantic, it was actually a very impulsive move. They weren't just celebrating their love, they were desperately trying to find a sense of stability. They hoped that by making a legal commitment, they could close the distance that was growing between them because of their hectic lives. The problem was that their connection, which looked so perfect in photos, was struggling to survive the reality of their daily lives. They were at completely different stages of life. Cindy was still very young and was just beginning to figure out who she was as an adult. She was focused on her growing career and the excitement of her new fame. Richard, on the other hand, was already tired of the spotlight. He was moving toward a life of meditation and quiet reflection. He wanted to sit in silence while she was still ready to fly across the world for her next big job. They were two good people who simply wanted different things out of life. In 1995, they realized that love alone wasn't enough to bridge the gap between their different goals, and they decided to end their marriage. After this very public breakup, Richard decided to step away from the cameras and look for a much quieter kind of love. Two different life speeds. Even though Richard and Cindy were married, they were living in two completely different worlds. Cindy Crawford was in her early 20s, and her career as a supermodel was reaching its highest point. She was traveling all over the world doing photoshoots and becoming a household name. Because she was so young, she was still figuring out who she was as a person. She felt a strong need to define herself through her work and the exciting opportunities that were coming her way. For Cindy, being in the public eye was part of her growth. She wanted to be active, visible, and successful in the fashion industry. On the other hand, Richard Gere was already in his 40s and was starting to feel very differently about fame. He had been a movie star for a long time, and the constant attention from the public was starting to wear him down. Instead of wanting more fame, he was looking for silence and peace. He spent a lot of his time meditating and studying Buddhism. He wanted to pull away from the loud Hollywood lifestyle and focus on his internal spiritual journey. While Cindy was busy moving forward in the fast-paced world of fashion, Richard was busy slowing down and looking inward. This created a major conflict because their daily needs and goals simply did not match anymore. This difference in their speeds led to what Cindy later called losing herself. Because Richard was older and very sure of his spiritual path, Cindy often tried to change her own behavior to make him happy. She wanted to be the woman he needed. So, she tried to follow his lead and live according to his rules and his quiet lifestyle. However, by doing this, she stopped listening to her own needs and desires. She was performing a role in their marriage rather than being her true self. This is the tragedy of their relationship. They both cared for each other, but they were walking on paths that were moving in opposite directions. By 1995, it became clear to both of them that they could no longer walk together. Their divorce was not filled with the typical Hollywood drama. There were no big public fights, no mean stories in the newspapers, and no legal battles over money. It was a very quiet and respectful ending. They both realized that they were no longer in sync. Richard wanted a partner who could share in his deep silence, and Cindy needed to be free to discover who she was as an independent woman. They decided to part ways simply because they had become different people with different requirements for happiness. After the split from Cindy, Richard decided to disappear from the spotlight for a while to see if he could find a different kind of partner who actually shared his love for the quiet life. Carrie Lell seeking grounding. After his divorce from Cindy Crawford in 1995, Richard Gere made a very specific choice. He decided to step away from the flashing lights and the constant attention of the paparazzi. He didn't want to be the center of a Hollywood spectacle anymore. Instead, he leaned further into his spiritual life, traveling to places like Nepal and Tibet to spend time in quiet meditation. He was looking for a life that felt more private and meaningful. He wanted to be around people who didn't care about fame or being on the cover of a magazine. During this time of seeking peace, he met Carrie Lell. Most people knew her as a Bond girl because she had starred in a James Bond movie, but in her real life, she was very different from that glamorous image. Carrie was a very calm and grounded person. She wasn't chasing the fast-paced world of fashion or trying to be a global superstar. She enjoyed the quiet life just as much as Richard did. Because she was so stable and relaxed, she offered Richard a different kind of partnership. They didn't need to go to big parties to feel happy. They were content just being together in a quiet environment. In the year 2000, when Richard was 51 years old, his life changed in a way he never expected. He and Carrie had a son named Homer. Becoming a father at an older age was a huge turning point for Richard. Before Homer was born, Richard spent most of his time thinking about his own spiritual growth and his own internal peace. He focused a lot on inward reflection, which means thinking about his own mind and feelings. But once he had a son, he had to shift his focus to outward care. This means he had to put the needs of another person before his own. He couldn't just sit in silence for hours if his son needed him. He had to learn how to be present for his family in a very practical way. He and Carrie eventually moved to a quiet area in New York called Pound Ridge, where they lived on a farm and focused on raising their son away from the noise of the city. For a long time, it seemed like Richard had finally found the perfect quiet life he had always wanted. But even in the middle of all that peace, a new kind of silence was starting to grow between them. When silence becomes absence. After his divorce from Cindy Crawford in 1995, Richard Gere made a very specific choice. He decided to step away from the flashing lights and the constant attention of the paparazzi. He didn't want to be the center of a Hollywood spectacle anymore. Instead, he leaned further into his spiritual life, traveling to places like Nepal and Tibet to spend time in quiet meditation. He was looking for a life that felt more private and meaningful. He wanted to be around people who didn't care about fame or being on the cover of a magazine. During this time of seeking peace, he met Carrie Lell. Most people knew her as a Bond girl because she had starred in a James Bond movie. But in her real life, she was very different from that glamorous image. Carrie was a very calm and grounded person. She wasn't chasing the fast-paced world of fashion or trying to be a global superstar. She enjoyed the quiet life just as much as Richard did. Because she was so stable and relaxed, she offered Richard a different kind of partnership. They didn't need to go to big parties to feel happy. They were content just being together in a quiet environment. In the year 2000, when Richard was 51 years old, his life changed in a way he never expected. He and Carrie had a son named Homer. Becoming a father at an older age was a huge turning point for Richard. Before Homer was born, Richard spent most of his time thinking about his own spiritual growth and his own internal peace. He focused a lot on inward reflection, which means thinking about his own mind and feelings. But once he had a son, he had to shift his focus to outward care. This means he had to put the needs of another person before his own. He couldn't just sit in silence for hours if his son needed him. He had to learn how to be present for his family in a very practical way. He and Carrie eventually moved to a quiet area in New York called Pound Ridge, where they lived on a farm and focused on raising their son away from the noise of the city. For a long time, it seemed like Richard had finally found the perfect quiet life he had always wanted. But even in the middle of all that peace, a new kind of silence was starting to grow between them. Padma Lakshmi the Bridge. In 2014, while his divorce from Carrie Lell was still moving through the legal system, Richard Gere met someone who helped him bridge the gap between his old life and his future. This person was Padma Lakshmi, the famous author and host of the television show Top Chef. They met backstage at a charity fundraiser event. At the time, both of them were wounded by public life. This means they had both gone through very difficult breakups and divorces that the whole world had watched and talked about. Because of this, they shared a feeling of emotional exhaustion. They were both tired of the drama and the noise that often comes with being a celebrity. when they started talking. They found comfort in the fact that they didn't have to explain themselves to each other. Their relationship was very different from the high-energy romances Richard had in the past. There were no grand red carpet entrances or big interviews where they talked about their love. Instead, they focused on healing in private. Their time together was characterized by quiet dinners and long, deep conversations. For a few months, this relationship served as a holding pattern. This means it was a safe space where both of them could stop running and just be still for a while. They weren't trying to build a lifelong empire together. They were simply two people recovering from their pasts and helping each other feel a little less alone. However, as the months went by, they realized that they were still moving in different directions. Padma was a vibrant woman who was still very much involved in the energy of public life and her career. Richard, as we have seen, was pulling further and further into his world of silence and meditation because they had both learned so much from their previous marriages. They didn't try to force the relationship to work. They understood a vital lesson. Harmony cannot be forced. If two people are not perfectly aligned on how they want to live their daily lives, love alone is not always enough to keep them together. Their breakup was completely mutual and featured no drama at all. They decided it would be better to remain friends because their lives were just not a perfect match. This was a very important moment for Richard because it was the first time he let go of a relationship without feeling regret or like he had failed. He realized that peace isn't just about being by yourself, it's about finding someone whose rhythm matches yours perfectly. This brief relationship with Padma softened his heart and prepared him for the most important meeting of his life, which was just around the corner. But he didn't have to wait long, because a chance encounter in Italy was about to change his life forever. Alejandra Silva, final home. In 2014, Richard Gere was visiting the beautiful town of Positano in Italy. He was staying at a hotel owned by the family of a woman named Alejandra Silva. At the time, both Richard and Alejandra were going through the difficult process of divorce. They were burdened by their pasts, which means they were both carrying the emotional weight and sadness of relationships that had ended. Because they were both in a similar place emotionally, they were able to see each other very clearly. They didn't see a movie star or a socialite. They saw two people who were looking for a fresh start and a sense of peace. In his younger years in Hollywood, Richard often chased love. He moved fast, lived a loud life, and was often driven by his career and his mysterious image. But with Alejandra, he used a completely different strategy. Instead of trying to impress her with his fame or grand gestures, he practiced waiting. He was very patient and gentle. He sent her flowers every day and wrote her handwritten letters. He even wrote short songs for her. He wasn't trying to win her or put on a performance to show how great he was. Instead, he was simply offering her peace and a steady, reliable presence. He wanted her to know that he wasn't there to rush her, but that he was there to stay. Alejandra was cautious at first. There was a 33-year age gap between them, and she was worried about the cost of living such a public life. However, she soon realized that Richard wasn't looking for a typical Hollywood romance. He was looking for a karmic transition, which is a spiritual way of saying their souls were moving toward the same goal. They shared a deep interest in helping others and finding internal quiet in 2018. They had a private Buddhist wedding. This was a very important moment because Alejandra decided to convert to Buddhism as well. She didn't do it because Richard asked her to, but because she felt a genuine shared rhythm with his beliefs. For the first time, Richard had a partner who didn't just tolerate his spiritual life, but lived it right alongside him. Together, they built a life that didn't ask anything from the outside world. They moved back to the farmhouse in Pound Ridge, but this time the house wasn't filled with silence and isolation. Instead, it was filled with music, children, and a sense of being home. Richard finally found a person he didn't have to convince to stay, because she never felt like she had to leave. They were no longer two people trying to complete each other. They were two people who were already whole, walking the same path together. Now that he has finally found his peace, Richard is looking at his life in a way he never has before. Wholeness over passion. Today, Richard Gere's life is very different from the one he had in the 1980s or 90s. In the past, a movie star's home might have been filled with awards, movie posters, and expensive items that reminded everyone of their fame. But in the farmhouse in Pound Ridge, where Richard lives with Alejandra, The morning routine is much more ordinary and peaceful. The house is filled with things like crayons, children's books, and the sound of his young sons playing. Richard still writes music every morning, but now he writes it for Alejandra. He still sends her flowers, not because he is trying to win her over, but because it brings him genuine joy. Their domestic life is focused on the present moment rather than their past career. This environment is the exact opposite of the movie memorabilia life he once knew. It is a place where he is just a father and a husband, not a global icon. The central philosophy of their marriage is what Richard calls being already whole. In many romantic stories, people say they are looking for their other half or someone to complete them. Richard believes this way of thinking puts too much pressure on a relationship. If you expect another person to fix your problems or make you feel complete, you will eventually be disappointed. Richard and Alejandra came together as two people who were already happy and stable on their own. Because they do not need each other to be whole, they can simply enjoy being together. This removes the pressure of expectation. Alejandra does not need Richard to be the perfect Hollywood husband, and Richard does not need Alejandra to be anything other than who she is. This creates a relationship built on total acceptance. This brings us to what we can call the final act of his journey. For decades, Richard's romantic life felt like a revolving door where women came and went. Many people thought the reason it didn't work out was that he needed to change who he was. However, the truth is that the door finally stopped spinning, not because he changed his personality, but because he stopped performing. For a long time, Richard was always playing a part, whether it was the sexiest man alive, the mysterious actor, or the intense spiritual seeker. When he met Alejandra, he finally felt safe enough to stop acting. He realized that when you stop trying to put on a show for someone else, you finally find the person who loves the real you. His life is no longer about the chase or the performance. It is about a quiet, shared rhythm that doesn't require any effort to maintain. Alejandra never had to be convinced to stay because she was never looking for the movie star. She was looking for the man who was already there waiting in the silence. Richard Gere didn't find his happy ending by finding a new character to play. He found it by finally being himself. Richard Gere's journey shows us that finding the one often starts with finding yourself. He spent decades under Hollywood's bright lights wearing different masks, only to realize that real connection happens in the quiet moments. By stepping away from the performance, he finally found a home that didn't require him to be anything but himself. Enjoyed this video? Hit that like button and subscribe for more icon stories. Ring the bell so you never miss an update. And let us know in the comments which part of Richard's journey surprised you the most. Thanks for watching.